Hello, today is July 19th, 2013. My name is Jason Ross, and I'm happy to be moderating this evening's LaRouche PAC webcast. This has been a particularly momentous week in Washington, D.C., as the entire LPAC Policy Committee has been here in town, and it's certainly safe to say that Glass-Steagall is on everybody's minds in the Capitol. The format for this evening, we have a number of questions that have come in, and Mr. LaRouche has asked that we begin with a question that came in from an institutional source, which will be followed with discussion from questioners here in the audience. So the first question to you, Mr. LaRouche, is that the questioner asks, your Political Action Committee is in the midst of a major deployment into Capitol Hill on behalf of Glass-Steagall. The issue has become a major point of attention in the recent weeks, both here in the United States and in Europe. In fact, the British media has given even greater positive attention to this than have the American media. And there is also strong motion for Glass-Steagall in Italy. Could you please give your assessment of where the fight stands at this moment? Clearly, the Wall Street crowd is in a mobilization to stop Glass-Steagall, seeing this as an existential issue. This is a serious uphill fight that you're leading. Where do we stand?
As things stand as of now, it will probably be during the coming 2 weeks that we will have a picture of exactly how this is going to work out. Now, what's on our side is reality. But Wall Street has a long record of being unreal, and therefore they're counting on unreality for their cause. However, at the same time, there are lots of uncertainties in this process. And the fact that we have 2 more weeks estimated as of now for the continuation of the contesting of this mission, we now have a fair possibility of winning. This is no longer out from left field. This is in the center of the ring. And it will be persisting. Now, the options are, of course, is that if we don't get Glass-Steagall through, you can forget the United States and Europe for an indefinite period to come, even possibly forever. Because if this, what the intention is, and this is what you have to really understand, the intention is to, first of all, defeat Glass-Steagall. That's the first objective. Once Glass-Steagall is rejected, or were rejected, then the next measure would be what is not advertised. There's no way in which the trans-European area can possibly effect a real bailout of themselves. They're hopelessly bankrupt. Their answer is, once Glass-Steagall were eliminated, then they would just simply shut off all payments to their debtors, which would mean you would throw a major part of the population of Europe and the United States in particular to sit on the streets and starve to death. And that is exactly what the intention is. If you look at this thing carefully, you don't have to have information on the inside to see what is threatened. All you have to do is look at the figures. The amount of debt, the rate of increase of that debt, of the Wall Street kind of debt, there's no possible way that they can avoid, as a Wall Street gang, they can avoid discrediting all of their debts to people generally. That means that the people will be shut off from all sustenance, which means mass death coming on fast inside the United States and also Western and Central Europe in large degree. So the point is we now have no real choice but Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is the only thing which will enable us to defend the nation against what the intentions are of the Wall Street and related forces. Now, there are other factors in this. You have an English factor, which is saying, well, let's not collapse everything. Let's save something in England or in a few other places. So it's a complex process, and there are no definite answers, questions and answers. What you're in a situation where objectively there's no way in which the current debt and growth of debt inside the United States in particular can be sustained much longer. And if Glass-Steagall were defeated, then Dodd-Frank and similar kinds of monstrosities would come in, and the effect would be the cancellation of those obligations. Because there's no way that this machinery that's now functioning as Wall Street could actually ever sustain the unpayable debts which they've now accrued. And that's where we stand. So therefore, the coming weeks may determine whether the people in the United States are going to live or die. That's where we are. And that's what the question really implies, is that. There is no possible way. We have to realize that the debt, the Wall Street debt, and similar kind of debt, could never be covered by obligations. Never. Is past that and going further. So therefore, the option is they stall everything as long as they can. Prevent Glass-Steagall from being introduced. And if they do that, then they cancel the debts. Now that Glass-Steagall has no claim on them, they will simply cancel the debts of Wall Street and similar forces around the world. And what will happen to the people? The obligations to the people simply don't exist because the debt is repudiated. And that's the situation we're in now. That is the reason, not why because people understand what's happening, but because they have a feeling of what is happening. They have a sense of what is happening. And they see no possibility of anybody doing anything to help them. And therefore they're trying to deny the threat, which is what people do. They try to say, no, everything's going to be all right, isn't it? Everything is going to be all right, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? Huh? And then, if Glass-Steagall comes through, rejoicing. And Wall Street is bankrupted. So, who does that hurt? Nobody of importance.
Sounds like it could be grounds for more rejoicing. So I'd like to ask Leandra Bernstein to pose the next question.
Thank you. Now, this question comes out of some discussion with the policy committee members who, as we've said, have done incredible work over the course of this week and now into next week in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's been very incredible. We've had over 40 pre-scheduled meetings. I don't think we have a final count for the number of total interactions and impromptu meetings that we've conducted to continue to push for signers on to Glass-Steagall and the entire recovery program, which begins with the re-implementation of Glass-Steagall. Now, rather than talk about all of the successes that we've had, I would like to raise some of the resistance that we've run up against and that the policy committee has run up against in the course of organizing. Now, this comes in the form of certain lines against Glass-Steagall, which anyone watching the media this week has more than likely been exposed to. Some of these lines: Glass-Steagall would not have stopped the 2008 crisis. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers had nothing to do with commercial banking. If we introduce Glass-Steagall, it will make U.S. banks less competitive. The new economy is too complex to go back to Glass-Steagall. Wall Street will lose money if Glass-Steagall is re-implemented. Dodd-Frank needs the chance to work which you made reference to how Dodd-Frank would work. And then a new one, which is very interesting, is it will never pass this Congress. Wall Street will leverage massive amounts of money and pressure in order to stop it. Now, these are all flagrant lies. Mm-hmm. The last one is an open threat, but the rest are lies, and they originate from primarily a single source, J.P. Morgan, who still appears to be very sore about what Franklin Roosevelt did back in the 1930s. And this is the same J.P. Morgan led the shutdown of Glass-Steagall, the same J.P. Morgan who came out in their own name against our initiative in the Delaware State House for a non-binding resolution to have the Delaware congressional delegation support Glass-Steagall. Now, in the context of this mobilization, you announced two initiatives this week. The first, you pose the question of who owns members of Congress, in particular, members of Congress on the Financial Services Committee. And second, you announced that we need a new Pecora Commission. Now, on the first, who owns Congress, we've looked into how much is being received in campaign funds, and really what's reported by the FEC is only a shadow of what is actually going into these campaigns, what Wall Street is putting in. We've covered the revolving door policy in Congress, where members of Congress themselves, aides, chiefs of staff, move from Washington to Wall Street to Washington to Wall Street. One member of the policy committee noted that in some of these offices, you really get the sense that it isn't the congressman who's running the show. So we have that material coming together, and secondly, on the Pecora Commission, you have in the original form the realization that all three branches, the exposure that all three branches of the United States government were being controlled by something that Ferdinand Pecora noted was the Wall Street force, which was a rival to the power of government itself, and they had become so powerful. They had become so powerful, and they viewed themselves, and others viewed them, as the untouchables. It's interesting. J.P. Morgan Sr. Had a quote: "My special job is the most interesting I know of anywhere. More fun than being king, pope, or prime minister anywhere. No one can turn me out of it, and I don't have to make any compromises with principles." Now that ended with the Pecora Commission and the instatement and the initial passage of Glass-Steagall. And when J.P. Morgan Jr. was hauled off to prison and J.P. Morgan Sr. passed away, his death was blamed on the stress of the Pecora Commission. So, like you said, not a loss to anyone of any significance. So, right now we're pulling together who would be the target of a new Pecora Commission. The banks, the institutions that need to be investigated in order to get to the criminals who need to be held responsible, who need to once again populate the halls and the cells of Sing Sing. So the question is whether, if you would please expand on those initiatives and how we take it into the coming weeks.
Okay. Well, sometimes it's hard to explain these things, but I think we can probably get by with that a little bit here. The point is, there is no possibility, first of all, in fact, there is no possibility that the bailout of Wall Street could succeed. The only objective that is involved is the following, as I said before, is to cause a defeat of Glass-Steagall, number one. The defeat of Glass-Steagall means there is no legal means to defend the people of the United States against Wall Street. At that point, Wall Street and its equivalents in Europe would then simply do the obvious thing. Since they could never pay their present debts, as the Wall Street and similar things, therefore the only thing that will happen is that Wall Street and company will default on their obligations. Now, their default on their obligations would mean the emptying of all banks. It would mean the condemnation of the majority of the population to starve to death. And that is no exaggeration. That's the exact situation. There is no way, when you take the magnitude of the debt which Wall Street and its transatlantic partners represent, they have no credit available to themselves, honestly. No credit on which to survive. The only thing they can do, because their debts are so enormous, unpayable debts are so enormous, they could never pay them off. Therefore, they simply, in order to maintain power, they get Glass-Steagall through, and then cancel the debts. You will not have them saying openly that they intend to cancel the debts until Glass-Steagall has been defeated. If Glass-Steagall is not defeated, they're finished. Now, what's the follow-on to that? Most people don't understand these things, but I think the coming 2 weeks, as I understand, is going to be the case. If we keep doing what we're doing, and other people join in doing what we're doing, I think we can win this fight. I think because of what we've seen as the non-linear curve upward of our efforts indicate that if we continue to go in this direction, Wall Street is finished. Wall Street will be dead. That will not be anything but a blessing. Because then what happens, we're going to go through another operation which is rarely understood. What is the implication of Glass-Steagall? What happens in a case like this with Glass-Steagall's response? The federal government goes back to the original Constitution of the United States, the federal Constitution, which is a credit system. And therefore, we will take the federal government will take the responsibility of creating a source of credit to promote further employment and similar kinds of useful benefits to the American people. And that will work. Now, people will say that can't work. That will work. In fact, it's the only thing that will work. The world in large, the transatlantic region in particular, is already hopelessly bankrupt. All it's waiting for is the realization of that bankruptcy. All that's keeping this thing alive is postponement of reality. In the coming 2 weeks, that reality is going to be pressing on the situation. Now, what the difference is this. These guys from Wall Street, these clowns and thieves, what they do is they create an idea of a system, which is a credit system of their own type. They invent the whole credit and allot it to themselves. But with us, with the U.S. tradition of which is the Glass-Steagall tradition, then we have a credit system. We don't have these overhangs. We have a credit system. We put people to work on credit, and that will lead to the increase of productivity, which will ultimately pay for the credit. Our job is to get people back to work in real production, and as fast as we can do it, and to protect the health care and protect the other things of our citizens. And if we can do that, we can restore the confidence of our citizens in themselves. The problem today is the citizen has no confidence in himself. Look at what has happened to him. He doesn't have any real employment anymore. If he has employment, he can't feed his children and himself too. Everything that's there is being lost. They're stripped of the ability to produce. The food supply is all totally inadequate. The present population cannot live on the existing flow of food supplies under the present conditions. Glass-Steagall, we can do it. But then it's going to be a tough job. But we will do it because we have to. We have to defend our citizens. But we've come to the point that this is the answer. And what's gone on with the Bushes and other kinds of fellows, that thing is going to come to an end. With Prescott Bush on down. The guy who funded Hitler. And that Bush and his children. That crowd is out. But there will be a rejuvenation of the people from being saved from what they know is happening. People know, parents know, when they feed their children, they're not going to eat. And this is the pattern throughout the nation. We can turn that around. We still are far short of enough to feed our own people, our own nation. It's not being produced. And food that is essential to our people is being turned into gasoline for trucks and so forth. And this is the enemy we have to eradicate, this whole policy. And we're going to have to do it. If we don't, the horrors that will hit the whole U.S. population and European population as well is unthinkable. The idea that we do not get Glass-Steagall through is morally unthinkable. And anybody who's opposing Glass-Steagall, whether they know it or not, is actually perpetrating a crime against humanity.
Well, I want to pose the next question by reiterating exactly the warning that you just made, to put it into context. You said, were Glass-Steagall to be defeated, then the banks would simply cease all payments to their debtors and default on their obligations, and a large part of the population of the United States and Europe would be condemned to simply sit on the street and starve to death. Now, the fact is, this has already begun to occur. As most people probably know, at the end of this week, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, becoming the largest municipality in U.S. history to do so. After several months of having been under literally a banker's dictatorship with an unelected financial controller sitting at the top of the destruction of the city and doing battle with the pensioners, the unions, the city workers, and so forth, the decision was made by this financial control board to file for Chapter 9 and to essentially cancel a large part of the obligations that were owed to these pensioners who worked for 20, 30, or more years to accumulate the pensions that were owed to them, canceling a large part of these pensions and declaring that they would be paying only pennies on the dollar of this multi-billion-dollar debt. Now, at the same time, Detroit, or the Financial Control Board of the City of Detroit, Kevin Orr, has announced that although they are not honoring the vast majority of the pensions that are owed to the people of Detroit, they have negotiated a deal with Bank of America and UBS in which they would be honoring the debts that they owe to those global banks, accepting 75 to 80 cents on the dollar, 80% or 75% on the dollar of Detroit's debt to those banks that were accrued under swaps deals, and giving this debtor in possession loan priority above all other creditors, including the people of Detroit, priority in bankruptcy proceedings. Now, this is a direct violation of the Michigan State Constitution. The Michigan State Constitution explicitly says that the debts, the pensions of public workers will not be defaulted on, in partial or in totality. So what has occurred in Detroit, I think, is a precursor of exactly what you have just warned about, which the rest of the United States can expect, and which is already occurring in Europe. And this situation should not come as a surprise. First of all, 1 year ago, a member of the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee, Bill Roberts, who at that time was running for Congress in Michigan, testified in front of the Detroit City Council and warned them in no uncertain terms that if you do not force through Glass-Steagall right now, Detroit will be destroyed at the hands of these Wall Street banks. His advice was not heeded, and instead the Financial Control Board was adopted. Also, in terms of explicit pre-stated intent, the circumvention of the Michigan Constitution should not come as a surprise either. In an explicit statement of intent that was published at the end of May of this year, J.P. Morgan, in a 14-page paper that was published in Europe titled Halfway There, explicitly stated that in order to complete the job of austerity, killer austerity, in the countries of Europe, the obstacle that was standing in the way were the national constitutions of the nations of Europe, the anti-fascist constitutions that were adopted after the fall of Hitler, that these were the obstacles standing in the way of a total banker's dictatorship to finish the job. And simultaneously echoed along with the J.P. Morgan report was an article that was published by Jürgen Randers, who was one of the co-authors of the 1972 book Limits to Growth, in which it was originally stated that the carrying capacity of the world was only a few billion people, which has been surpassed since that time. Jürgen Randers, in this article that was published echoing the J.P. Morgan report, stated that democracy has failed, representative government has gotten in the way of the genocide scheme, and in meeting the so-called challenge of climate change, what is needed are authoritarian systems. And he praised the fact that in Italy, the birth rate has now dropped below the death rate, that Italy has the lowest birth rate in the world, only 1.3 children per woman, because in the last 20 years, a society has been created making it impossible for a woman to both have a job and a child, praising this as the paradigm for the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. So the intent was stated directly. This is a confirmation of the warning which you have just issued, and this is also a confirmation of the warning that you issued when the original Limits to Growth Malthusian report was published. In 1971, when Nixon destroyed the Bretton Woods exchange rate system, you stated that what is in store for the future of humanity is shocked without Hitler. And this is what we're seeing now, the precursor of which is happening now in Detroit, and what has been put into explicit language by none other than J.P. Morgan themselves, with an explicitly genocidal intent. So I would like it if you could address the situation that we've now seen occur in the case of Detroit and what this means for the future of the United States.
What I've done in the past days have actually gone with an activation of the countermeasures. And that's that simple. We simply have to bankrupt these bastards, is I think the proper polite language to use in this case. And because we can, by going back simply to a document which is directed by the Chief Treasurer of the United States, which is the same thing as the Glass-Steagall thing. Once that's done, then the United States government takes over its responsibilities under the Constitution for the situation that now exists. And anyone who opposes that is an enemy of the U.S. Constitution and should be so characterized and described and told. Because what they're doing, as we see in this Detroit thing you just referred to, you're talking about genocide. Genocide against people of a city, a large city. Remember what happened, how this happened. It's a funny story, isn't it? We had an effort to shut down Detroit and what things associated with the auto industry. I got in on the thing to organize a countermeasure against that attempt. We were succeeding, but other special pressures came in. And then I was confronted at a large conference we had, which I had organized, by some people saying, no, we're not going to go along with what you're doing. We're going to take our money and run. And as a result of that, all this has happened in Detroit, for example, in the auto industry. Now, we had alternatives. We went through the whole business. We went through it officially, through the entire auto industry, people involved in it. And we calculated what we had to do to reverse the trend which had led to this crisis, or led into this crisis. And it could have been dealt with. It would have meant the change in the policies of someone like the Bush family and so forth. And the Bush family wouldn't have liked what I was going to do. And they got their way. And the Bush family has probably caused the death of a large number of people who are pensioners now and otherwise in Detroit and elsewhere. That's what's happening. So the point is, do we, as the United States in particular, because our republic and its constitution are unique in this planet, there is no constitutional structure to match our government, our constitution, in terms of dealing with these kinds of problems. What we have to do is recognize that this is our enemy. What's happening in Detroit, for example, is the action of our enemy, the enemy of the people of the United States. And the people of the United States have to take their own authority back under our constitutional privileges. And this kind of swindle, just these guys are going to be thrown out. Our job in putting Glass-Steagall through is that Glass-Steagall now becomes the pretext for the action. In other words, if Glass-Steagall is upheld, it becomes automatically, by the law, by the vote itself, the agency which reverses this horror. Just enforce Glass-Steagall, and that will give us the means to solve the problem. But it means that the people of the United States have to mobilize to make sure that the law is enforced, and start enforcing it now. And the intention should be now to do just exactly that. It's the only chance to save the life of your neighbors and your family.
Now, I think it should be clear to everyone that in dealing with Wall Street, we are dealing with the legacy of fascism. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt warned that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism. The ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. Now, we're also dealing with a different legacy, a family tree, you could call it, or you could call it a family bush. That heredity starts with Prescott Bush, who married into the family of George Herbert Walker, who represented the New York J.P. Morgan interests and created Harriman and Company, now Brown Brothers Harriman. Now, he put Prescott on as vice president of the bank, and later the two of them set up an organization called the Union Banking Corporation. Now, this Union Banking Corporation wasn't exactly what its name might suggest, but it was a shell bank, a slush fund for the Thyssen interests in Germany, including Fritz Thyssen, who famously wrote the book, I Funded Hitler. But this Union Banking Corporation served as the slush fund for the initial sponsorship and funding of Adolf Hitler, and later the funding of the armaments to the Nazi Party. This was eventually stopped under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but by that time, the family fortune of the Bushes was already made and secured, and they cashed out after World War II. Now, the idea at that time, and what people often forget about the rise of that fascist movement, the system was crashing. They intended to stay in control of that crash, and the way it was to be done is through political control to serve those interests on Wall Street, thus the creation of fascist governments. Now, to continue the legacy, you have Bush Sr., which he was an interesting president and an interesting president of Vice, and I'll just mention a little side story on Bush Sr. that one of his sons was he famously had to cancel a dinner engagement with the brother of the Reagan assassin, John Hinckley Jr. Their dinner engagement was called off on March 30th, 1981, when Hinckley attempted to murder the president who had only been in office for 69 days, and the future President Bush had to wait. This is the joke. Now that gets us to Bush Jr. and what the profile of Bush Jr. is: the launching of the global war on terrorism following the 9/11 attacks, which we've documented were the result of the collaboration between a grouping within the United States government with the Saudi Arabian monarchy and Great Britain. Now, virtually that day, 9/11, 2001, there were unprecedented policy changes, and they were already ready to go. The Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, the ability to monitor phone communications, electronic communications, medical records, financial records, the massive expansion of the NSA, what was already a coup in 2001, which you warned about in January of 2001. Now, that gets us to the current president, Barack Obama. With the NSA revelations, people do have the sense, increasingly, that they are living under a dictatorship. The funding of the Syrian rebels, the overthrow of regimes in the Middle East, bringing us to the brink of nuclear war, not just regional limited warfare. Also, what has been revealed as a massive spying on economic activities, especially in Europe among our partners, to anticipate how to install measures such as a bailout and the bail-in. So, my question to you is a little bit of a curveball, because in the past few months there were revelations about the famed birth certificate, which was posted on government sites of President Barack Obama. His own lawyer admitted that the image of that birth certificate was a fraud. So my question to you is Barack Obama actually a Bush?
I don't think there's much difference. He's fairly empty, he's nasty, but he's not really in control. I mean, we have to understand, and when you get to this point, you've got to say, no, really, who is really running the show? And it's not Barack Obama. Barack Obama is only a stooge put in by the British monarchy. That's all he is. He's got a nasty disposition. As you know, snakes have nasty dispositions. All kinds of creatures have nasty dispositions. But the fact is, who controls him? The control lies with, obviously, the equivalent of the Roman Empire today. And that is the Anglo-Dutch Empire. And the Holland, the Netherlands, and the British are one in the same thing. It's the same empire. Even nominally, it represents about 40% of the whole world system. So you're dealing with an empire like the Roman Empire in the form of the Anglo-Dutch system. And the Dutch are probably more vicious than the British, in point of fact. At least they are on record. After all, they started the whole thing. The British came along later. They were just English at that point. But when the Dutch sent their troops into Britain, everything was changed. And the Dutch fascists, really what they were and are, took over the British Empire. And so you have a Queen of England who is actually controlled, in fact, on behalf of this Anglo-Dutch organization, which invaded England, conducted the purge, the bloodshed against the Irish. Same thing, same crowd. So what we're dealing with the fact that evil in the tradition of the Roman Empire, and similar things, actions of that type, has taken over domination of the world. It's been able to do so because the United States, which was always being persecuted by the empire forces, we kept fighting back. But we continued to find, we had presidents who were shameless creatures, animals more than men, for example, and that has persisted. Now the time has come since this, and also on top of everything else, what have we got? These openly by the Queen of England and also her Dutch colleagues. The intention is to reduce the population of the world rapidly from 7 billion people to less than 1 billion people. That operation is presently underway. It's been advertised publicly and widely by Her Majesty and others. It's stated in every possible way you want to see in terms of Europe, in terms of policy, and especially in terms of policy of practice. This thing is the enemy of the human species. And there has to be a process of clean-out in which the power that these people have held is taken away from them. We point to the crimes they have committed and they have intended to commit, which they have admitted to intending to commit against humanity. And therefore, we have the obligation of recognizing this, and while we have the ability to do so, to mobilize the citizens of this nation and other nations to eradicate this fungus from humanity.
Okay, on the subject of genocide, we have a question which has been submitted by a member of our team who has been involved in a series of meetings in Congress on the subject of your initiative to repeal the ethanol mandate. And I'm just going to read the question as it was stated. It reads, "Dear Mr. LaRouche, as you are aware, we have begun to meet with members and staffers of the Congress on your call to end the ethanol mandate, and there is a particular problem which has come up in some of these meetings. There are currently 2 bills in the House on this, one which calls for the repeal of the renewable fuels standard, which has a matching bill in the U.S. Senate, and a weaker one which calls for mere reform of the mandate. Several of the offices which we've met with, after we've briefed them on the millions of human deaths around the world due to this policy, and the shortages of grains at any price, have assured us that they, too, do not want food to be burned as fuel, citing the high price of feed and the consequent loss of poultry and other livestock operations in their own districts. But they have said that they are hesitant to repeal the renewable fuels standard altogether, because doing so would jeopardize startup companies in their districts which are working on non-food related green energy. At this point in these meetings, we take the time to go through one of your principal discoveries of physical economics, namely the concept of energy flux density. This has had a good effect, but I think if you were to speak on this, it would be very helpful. These people seem to believe that green energy is good for the environment and good for the economy in that it creates jobs on the ground today and should thus be protected. Can you address this? Thank you.
Yes, I think I can address that quite happily and so forth. The question is cowardice. What you're talking about are people who say something should be done about this, the harm should be removed, but we don't want to take and interfere with private rights to conduct businesses. Eh? Well, I say if you are coming in and you're saying that you have to continue to kill people in order to meet the obligations which you have undertaken in terms of ethanol, then you are a criminal. In other words, if you intend to deprive American citizens of their life for the sake of meeting an ethanol requirement, then you are already a criminal. And your rights to oppose the elimination of that provision is automatic. If it's not, there's something very rotten in the top of government itself. Now, the way you want to understand this is most Americans are cowards. They're essentially cowards. Sometimes Americans who are very influential seem to be very powerful. But when they get up to this thing, where something like the business community, Wall Street, interferes, they crumble. They're terrified. They refuse to do anything. And therefore, when you allow your neighbor to be murdered, and you stood there and watched it happen and didn't do anything to prevent it, you are a criminal. And the only way to get some guts in some Americans who have this default in them is to say, look, buddy, if you're supporting that, we can't trust you because we know you're a criminal. First, you've got to clean the criminal out of you, and then we can respect you.
Now, this is a question which has come in from our international audience. It's a question which comes from the institutional level in Belarus. The question is from Yuri Tsarik, who is the head of the Belarus Development Group. The question reads as follows. It is obvious that a new world financial order based on the credit systems of sovereign nation-states can be formed under the condition of the great powers' transition to credit systems and national banking, and reaching the necessary agreements between them regarding great infrastructure projects and the respective sovereign credit to finance them. But, in present conditions, when there is no such system, what should be the policy of smaller nation-states, such as, for example, Belarus, Ukraine, or Serbia? Is it possible to reach any agreements regarding infrastructure development in the present monetary financial order? What are the opportunities and limitations for introducing a credit system in a country with a considerable external trade deficit?
Well, I have addressed that question specifically in those countries, and there's no doubt that this could be done. What's required is simply as much agreement among nations as possible. If you have several nations, each of which is a relatively smaller nation or weaker nation, and you combine these people as a common force, under present conditions, you have a fighting chance of winning. If you just sit there and take it and say we can't do anything about it, you're gone. But the point is, we've often had the case, as in the American Revolution and every other great movement for humanity, that some people have risked their lives or even sacrificed them in order to defend mankind against these types of horror shows. And they have to be respected for doing that. But if they don't have the guts to do that, then they're not respectable. That's the point. The obligation of the human species is, first of all, to do something to defend the human species and to promote its development. And if people will not base themselves on that principle or that commitment, they're not worth much. And we'll have to go to other people to find people with the guts and honor to do what's necessary. We're in that time. We're not in a time where mere opinions and the swing of opinions from one aspect to another can change the course of history. It cannot be allowed under these circumstances. There is an imperative, a moral imperative, which lies here. That moral imperative outweighs anything else. And anyone who doesn't support the moral imperative is guilty. If you will not defend your fellow man, you're not worth anything. And that's the reality of this situation. I think that by making clear and putting right under the nose of people exactly what their cowardice represents, their failure to get out there and fight to stop this horror show. If they won't stop the horror show, then they're criminals. Maybe criminals because of cowardice? Yeah, but that's still a criminal in this case. No, the fact, I think the conditions are such. Western and Central Europe are in what appears to be a hopeless situation. Portugal, Spain, Italy, so forth, Greece, so forth, are being murdered. And nothing in Europe is being done to stop that. Nothing. So those nothings who are doing nothing to defend the rights of human beings in nations, they've got nothing coming to them. And cowardice is not a virtue. It is not a valuable commodity that you can enjoy. No, the time has come that people have to stand up. As in France, the resistance against the Nazis in France, for example, it was a fight, but they did it. They fought, and they were fighting under terrible conditions. Often, saved Europe from horrors. So the fact that something is frightening does not mean you have the justification for not opposing it. As a human being, you are responsible to humanity, not just to yourself. If you're not useful to your fellow human being, you're not useful. If you cannot defend your fellow human being, you're not worth it. In other words, there are costs and risks which people and nations take in order to gain the freedoms which are essential to them now. And you cannot be crawling around like stinking cowards under the sewer pipe, which is what many people have been doing. They've come to the point that if we stand up for them, which we are doing, and other people join us in standing up for the same thing, we have a fair chance of accomplishing the task. Because everyone out there, despite their cowardice, knows that this is true, or will admit it when they get their guts up. And that's the situation. We're in a crucial moment of history. It's a question of choices. Forget this so-called choices stuff, democratic choices. The question is, there are certain things you must do if you're a decent person. And that's a law. You must do it. Or you must do something in that direction. You must make a contribution to that cause. That's how nations were created, by that. We're now at a point where we cannot submit to crimes against humanity when we know they are crimes against humanity. And it's the choice we have. It's a choice we must make. And I think we have, at this moment, in this short interval of history, I think we have the opportunity to accomplish that. It just takes enough people with the insight and guts to do the job.
All right, now I'd like to pose the final question of the evening. And I'd like to start it off by thanking everyone who participated in this past week's mobilization. Thanks to what you've done with the LaRouche PAC as individuals, as groups, working toward winning this fight, we've gained a lot of political momentum. We've also advanced our fundraising goals as well. And given the fact that we have reached these certain objectives, the fight is nowhere close to being won. And this past week in Washington, D.C., there was a heat index of over 100 degrees. And we actually need to turn up the heat in Washington, D.C. this coming week and the week following that. Now, some people have expressed to our organizers that in making calls to their congressional offices or sending letters, they're not really making a difference. They are making a difference. They're making a significant difference. And if we go into an office, if members of the policy committee representing you, your state, your region, go into an office and say, hey, we have support. We have support from back in your district, but you haven't called their office, then that means we are not doing everything that we can do. But over the past week, we've gotten a number of emails sent into the info.larouchepac@gmail account. One of them saying, Mr. LaRouche, I have the highest admiration and respect for you and the people working for you. What you have done is just almost impossible and incredible. You have other people who are really taking up the initiative to move this fight forward, to win this fight. You have people contacting their congressmen. One gentleman writes, I've repeatedly called upon all on my mailing list to contact their senators and congresspeople, demanding they support H.R. 129 and S. 985 or face defeat in the next election or even recall. Another person says, I wonder if perhaps the LaRouche people in D.C. are making some of the bankster-controlled bunny rabbits in Congress more and more open to listening to the American people. I surely hope so. Someone else writes in, I've created blogs and posted on various social media, Facebook, Instagram, and other websites spreading awareness. I will continue to spread the word. So, again, we've reached certain objectives in this past week, but given the fight and the nature of our enemy, which you've discussed at length tonight, we still need to escalate. And any of the cynicism, the pessimism, the fear that people have expressed in the past, now is the time to crack the shell. So I'd like you to address what we're going to do this coming week. What does the escalation have to be? And I'll also mention that last night, in a discussion with the policy committee, you said being in the United States as a citizen is the greatest advantage we can have right now. And you said the key is having an integrated group which is committed to a common outcome for humanity. So if you could address the escalation, it would be appreciated.
There was a time, first in the 17th century, with the settlement in Massachusetts, and then the attempted rebirth of that movement in the 18th century, led by people like Benjamin Franklin. We created in the United States an institution of organization, which was able to, at first, during the previous century, until the Massachusetts colony was suppressed, but set a standard of performance in terms of its economic design, of its intentions and so forth, which was more advanced than we ever were able to succeed in doing in the 18th century, in the same United States, essentially. But in the United States, despite all the bums who the British managed to sneak in as influences, for example, we had the President Washington in his second term, in closing that term, spoke plainly of the wreaking disorder and dishonor among the president, the new presidency of the third presidency of the United States. And we didn't recover from that too much until the 1820s, 1830s. But despite the fact that we were defeated by traitors such, and like, murderers, thieves, skunks, so forth, and despite the fact that the British banking system moved in on Washington as well as on Massachusetts and controlled those states for most of the period up to the time of the Civil War. And in the whole period of the U.S. presidency, its existence, most of the time, the people who were presidents were either disgusting because they were weakling, or they were actually criminals. Going into the 20th century, we had most of the people that were up to Roosevelt, most of them were really criminals. And so when Roosevelt came to power, it was the entry into government again of a man who is capable to lead this nation. And so we as the United States have the greatest conception of a constitution which ever existed on this planet. And whatever we were able to win the usage of those principles, we in the United States have been successful in serving our mission to our own nation and government. And that's where we are now. We're a bunch of bums in this country now. They're weaklings. They've given in on almost everything. They're almost prostitutes in terms of what their behavior is. But when push comes to shove, they're still patriots. And what they need is a juice of courage to do what is necessary. The possibility of doing this, of changing the direction of this planet in respect to what the transatlantic community has been generally up to this point, we can and must resuscitate our commitment to our deepest understanding of the principles of our republic. If we do that, and if we fight as Washington led his troops and so forth, and others, in defending the existence of the United States, we have the chance to win. If we do not fight, the planet will become a nest of evil. We have no choice. We have a commitment embedded within us as the people of a nation to carry forth what our principles have been. And if we do, we have the right to win back what our country represents, and to seek alliances with other nations who will respect what we are committed to doing. If we lack that capability, there is no visible hope for humanity under the present circumstances. We have no option but to commit ourselves totally to that result. We must do it, and we must do it now. That's the essential mission before us at this time.
Thank you, Lynn. I think with those very clear marching orders, we're bringing this webcast to a close. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Matt and Leandra. Thank you for joining us. And thank you in advance for the phone calls you're going to make, the emails you're going to send, the bus you're going to take to Washington, D.C., and the contribution you're going to make via our website. Good night.